There are moments in life when heaven seems quiet. We pray, but no response comes. We seek, yet the way remains hidden. We knock, only to hear the echo of our own persistence. In these moments, doubt whispers, "Has God forgotten you?" And yet, nothing could be further from the truth. Silence is not abandonment. In fact, it is often the clearest sign that something is being prepared beyond what we can see. Imagine an artist standing before a canvas. Before a single stroke of paint is laid, there is silence. Before a composer writes the first note of a masterpiece, there is quiet. Before the dawn breaks, the world rests in stillness. Silence is not a void, it is preparation. And so it is with God. When we feel that nothing is happening, He is preparing a masterpiece, a victory so profound that when it arrives, we will understand why the waiting was necessary. Faith is not built in noise and certainty, but in the quiet spaces of trust. It is easy to believe when miracles are visible, when prayers are answered swiftly, and when doors swing open without effort. But true faith is forged in the unseen, in the seasons where God appears to be silent. These are the moments where we learn that trust is not about understanding His plan. It is about believing in His goodness, even when His voice cannot be heard. There are times in life when silence surrounds us like an impenetrable fog. We pray, but no response comes. We search for signs, yet the heavens remain still. We wait in expectation, only to be met with quiet that stretches endlessly. It is in these moments that doubt creeps in, whispering questions we dare not ask aloud. Has God turned away? Has He forgotten us? Has our faith been misplaced? Yet it is in these very moments of silence that something profound is happening. Something beyond what the eye can see or the heart can immediately understand. Silence does not mean absence. The lack of a visible sign does not equate to the absence of divine movement. The quiet is not an indication that nothing is happening. Rather, it is the very space in which God does His deepest, most transformative work. The earth does not tremble when a seed begins to sprout beneath the soil, yet deep within the darkness, roots are forming, life is taking shape, and in time what was hidden will burst forth into the light. So it is with God's work in our lives. History tells us that the greatest victories are often preceded by seasons of silence. Before the dawn of a new day, the night holds its breath in stillness. Before a mighty storm breaks, there is an eerie calm. Before the cry of a newborn baby fills a room, there is a hush of anticipation. Silence is not the absence of activity. It is the preparation for what is to come. It is the space where strength is built, faith is refined, and unseen miracles are set into motion. Consider the life of Joseph. Sold into slavery, falsely accused and imprisoned, he spent years waiting in what seemed like divine silence. No clear answer, no sudden rescue, no immediate justice. Yet all the while God was at work, orchestrating a plan far greater than Joseph could imagine. When the silence finally broke, it was not with a whisper but with a declaration of purpose. Joseph was not only freed, but elevated, not only rescued, but positioned to save nations. What seemed like abandonment had actually been preparation. The silence was never empty. It was filled with the unseen hand of God, shaping a destiny. And what of David, anointed as king but forced to flee into the wilderness, living in caves and hiding from his enemies? Surely in those lonely nights the silence must have felt unbearable. The promise of kingship had been spoken, yet the path to the throne seemed lost in shadows. But God was never absent. The silence was a classroom, teaching him perseverance, humility, and the heart of a shepherd, so that when the moment of fulfillment came, he was not only a king by title, but a king by character. The years of waiting were not wasted. They were essential. In our own lives, we may not see the full picture of what God is doing. The unanswered prayers, the closed doors, the unexpected delays, these can feel like divine silence, as if heaven itself has gone quiet. But just because we do not hear an immediate response does not mean God is not working. His silence is not indifference. It is often the sign of something greater being arranged behind the veil of time, something that can only be revealed when the moment is right. Perhaps the silence is not punishment, but protection. Perhaps what we are asking for is not yet ready for us, or we are not yet ready for it. Perhaps if the door were opened too soon, we would walk into something unprepared, unequipped, and unaware of the weight of the blessing we desire. Just as a loving parent does not hand a child the keys to a car before they have learned to drive, God, in his wisdom, does not release certain things before their appointed time. His silence, then, is not rejection but grace. And yet, even in silence, God leaves traces of his presence. The breath in our lungs, the rising of the sun, the inexplicable peace that comes when we surrender our fears. These are his whispers. A kind word from a stranger, a passage of scripture that speaks directly to our hearts, an opportunity that appears just when we need it. These are his subtle reminders that he has not left us. He is near, even when he is quiet. So what should we do in the silence? We wait, not in despair, but in expectation. We trust, not in our own understanding, but in his perfect wisdom. We remain faithful, knowing that just because we cannot see the movement does not mean the movement is not happening. The seed in the soil does not question the darkness, it simply grows. And so must we. God's silence is never empty. It is never the end of the story. It is the space where faith is tested, character is built, and destinies are shaped. And when the time is right, the silence will break, and what God has been preparing all along will be revealed in a way that leaves no doubt. It was his hand guiding it all. There are moments in life when everything seems still, when prayers go unanswered and the heavens appear silent. In these quiet seasons, doubt may creep in, whispering that perhaps faith has been misplaced, that perhaps God has turned his face away. But the truth is, faith is not proven in the noise, in the miraculous signs, or in the moments of undeniable clarity. Faith is refined, strengthened, and deepened in the quiet, in the waiting, in the seasons where God seems distant, but is, in reality, nearer than ever. The world often equates progress with movement, with visible signs of success, with doors flying open and paths clearing before us. But faith is not of the world. It operates on a different plane. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. It does not require proof. It thrives without it. And so, when life becomes still, when God does not answer in the way or the timing we expect, it is not an indication that he is absent. It is an invitation to grow in trust, to let faith take deeper root, to rely not on what is seen, but on the certainty of his promises. Consider a tree planted by a river. In the rainy season, when water is abundant, its roots may not need to stretch deep. It can draw sustenance easily without effort. But when the rains cease and the earth begins to dry, the tree is forced to send its roots further down, searching for the hidden reservoirs beneath the surface. It is in the dry season that the tree becomes unshakable, firmly anchored, able to withstand storms when they come. So it is with faith. In seasons of abundance, when prayers are answered swiftly and life moves effortlessly, faith does not need to stretch. But in the quiet seasons, when nothing seems to be happening, when all we have is trust, our faith is given the chance to deepen, to anchor itself in the certainty of God rather than in the visible circumstances around us. History is filled with those whose greatest transformations happened in the quiet. Joseph was given a dream of greatness, but before he could step into it, he endured years of silence, years in a pit, in slavery, in a prison where the world forgot him. But in that silence, something was happening. His faith was growing, his character was being shaped, and when the time came, he was not only ready for his destiny, but also prepared to handle it with wisdom. Moses spent decades in the wilderness before he ever saw the burning bush. The Israelites wandered for 40 years before entering the Promised Land. Even Christ himself spent 30 years in relative obscurity before stepping into his public ministry. If faith were only necessary in moments of action, these waiting periods would have been meaningless. But they were not. They were essential. They were the proving grounds where trust was built, where dependence on God was established, where the unseen work of preparation was being done. It is in the quiet that we learn to rely not on signs, not on feelings, not on immediate answers, but on the unshakable truth of who God is. When everything is stripped away, when all that is left is faith itself, we discover that it is more than enough. We discover that God does not always speak in thunder and fire, but often in a whisper, in a still, small voice that can only be heard when the noise of the world is silent. And yet the quiet seasons are not easy. There is a temptation to force an answer, to manufacture progress, to grasp for anything that gives a sense of movement. But true faith does not rush ahead. It rests, it waits, it trusts that even when nothing appears to be happening, God is still working. Just as a seed planted in the soil does not immediately break the surface, but is nevertheless growing beneath, so too does faith grow in the unseen places, in the quiet seasons, in the waiting. The world tells us to measure our worth by our productivity, by what we can show, by the results we can see. But God works differently. He is not in a hurry. He is not bound by time as we are. He is not concerned with speed but with depth. And so, when we find ourselves in a quiet season, when it feels as though we have been forgotten, we must remember, faith is growing, God is preparing, the roots are stretching deeper, the foundation is being strengthened, and when the time is right, what has been hidden will break forth in ways beyond what we could have imagined. In the end, faith that has been tested in silence is faith that cannot be shaken. It is faith that does not waver when trials come, when storms rage, when the world says all hope is lost. It is faith that remains standing, unwavering, because it was forged in the quiet, in the stillness, where God was moving all along. There is a temptation in human nature to seek instant results, to desire the reward without the process, the victory without the struggle, the fulfillment without the waiting. But throughout history, the greatest breakthroughs have always been preceded by a season of preparation, often unseen, often misunderstood, often difficult. It is in this waiting, in this refining, that the foundation is laid for something greater than the mind can yet comprehend. The seed is planted long before the harvest. The roots must strengthen before the tree can stand tall, and the vessel must be shaped before it is ready to be filled. It is in the quiet, in the hidden spaces, that the work is being done. No great structure is built without first ensuring the strength of its foundation. The deeper the calling, the longer the preparation. The higher the mountain to be climbed, the more endurance is required. The greater the destiny, the more refinement must take place beforehand. The temptation is to see the waiting as wasted time, but nothing could be further from the truth. The waiting is where character is forged, where faith is strengthened, where the soul is prepared for the weight of the blessing that is to come. Throughout history, those who walked in divine purpose were never rushed into their calling. They were given visions, promises, and dreams, but before stepping into them, they endured long seasons of preparation. Joseph was given a dream of leadership, yet he found himself betrayed, enslaved, and imprisoned for years. To the world, it looked like failure. To the impatient, it would seem as though the dream had died. But in reality, the preparation was underway. Each trial shaped him, each setback refined him, each moment in the shadows made him ready for the light. And when the time came, he did not simply step into leadership. He ruled with wisdom, humility, and strength, because he had been prepared. Moses, a man chosen to lead an entire nation, did not begin his calling from a place of power. He spent years in the wilderness, years in exile, years in solitude, where no one saw his growth but God. And yet, that wilderness season was necessary. He had to be stripped of his own strength so that he could walk in divine strength. He had to be removed from the palace so he could understand the struggles of the people he would lead. He had to be humbled before he could be exalted. Even the greatest example of all, Christ himself, did not immediately step into his ministry. 30 years of preparation preceded 3 years of impact. If the Son of God did not bypass the process, why should anyone else expect to? The quiet years were not wasted years. The obscurity was not failure. The waiting was not an indication of being forgotten. It was the shaping, the refining, the necessary foundation upon which everything else would be built. There is something within human nature that resists preparation. It is difficult to be in the in wave, where the promise has been given but the fulfillment has not yet arrived. It is challenging to hold on to faith when nothing visible seems to be changing. And yet, that is where faith becomes real. It is easy to believe when everything falls into place, when doors swing open effortlessly, when success is immediate, but true faith is proven in the waiting, in the seasons where nothing makes sense, but trust remains. The world may not see the preparation, others may not understand the process, but nothing is wasted. Every lesson, every trial, every challenge is a step closer to the breakthrough. A warrior does not step into battle without training. A builder does not raise a structure without first laying the groundwork, and no one receives a crown without first carrying a cross. The preparation is not a delay, it is an act of love. It is a divine assurance that what is coming will not be too heavy to bear, that the victory will not be squandered, that the blessing will not be misused. There will be moments when the process feels endless, when doubt whispers that perhaps the promise was imagined, that perhaps the waiting will never end, but the truth is, nothing is happening by accident. Every struggle is strengthening. Every setback is refining. Every silent season is molding something within that could not be shaped in the noise of immediate success. The unseen work will one day be revealed, and when the breakthrough comes, it will not simply be a moment of celebration, it will be the fulfillment of a purpose that was prepared for all along. The greatest victories do not come to those who rush ahead, but to those who allow themselves to be prepared. The strongest faith is not found in the absence of trials, but in the endurance of them. The most profound breakthroughs are not given to those who demand them instantly, but to those who have been refined to carry them with wisdom and strength. The waiting is never wasted. The preparation is never meaningless. The breakthrough is always on the horizon for those who trust that every moment of refinement is a step toward something far greater than they could ever imagine. There is a profound mystery in obedience, especially when it is met with silence. It is one thing to follow when the path is clear, when the voice of guidance is loud, when the signs are evident and unmistakable. But it is another to walk forward when the heavens seem quiet, when prayers appear unanswered, when the soul longs for direction, yet hears nothing in return. And yet it is precisely in these moments, when nothing seems to move, when clarity is absent, when the waiting stretches endlessly, that obedience becomes the foundation for revelation. To obey when all is clear is simple. It requires little trust to follow a well-lit road. But to obey in the silence is to step into the unknown with nothing but faith. It is to move forward without reassurance, to trust in the unseen, to hold fast to the belief that though the silence feels like absence, it is in fact preparation. Many struggle in these moments, assuming that silence means abandonment, that the lack of immediate answers is a sign that they have been forgotten. But history tells a different story. The greatest revelations have always been preceded by seasons of quiet, where those who were called to walk a path had to trust in something deeper than their own understanding. It was in the silence of the wilderness that Moses was prepared to lead. 40 years passed between the time he fled from Egypt and the time he returned to set the captives free. 40 years of waiting, of wondering, of hearing nothing from the God who had placed a calling upon his life. And yet, when the moment came, when the voice finally spoke from the burning bush, it was not a new calling that was given, but the fulfillment of the one that had been there all along. The silence was never a void. It was a time of shaping, of refining, of preparing a man to carry out a mission far greater than himself. The same was true for Joseph, whose dreams of leadership were met not with immediate fulfillment, but with betrayal, slavery, and imprisonment. There were years in which nothing made sense, where the silence of heaven seemed deafening, where obedience led him deeper into suffering rather than into success. And yet he continued in faith, continued to trust, continued to obey, even when there was no reason to believe that obedience would lead anywhere. And when the time came, when the silence broke, it was not just personal restoration that awaited him, but a revelation that his entire journey had been part of something far greater than he could have imagined. Even Christ himself, before he began his ministry, spent 40 days in the wilderness, alone, in the silence, where he was tested and prepared. The silence was not emptiness. The waiting was not wasted. The obedience in those moments was the very thing that strengthened him for what lay ahead. Obedience in silence requires a level of faith that is not built in ease. It demands trust when there is no proof, when there is no visible movement, when everything within cries out for certainty but receives none. And yet those who endure it, those who hold fast to obedience, even when the silence stretches on, are the ones who will see the greatest revelations. For in the silence, things are being set in motion that cannot yet be seen. The heart is being refined, the path is being prepared, and the moment of breakthrough is drawing closer. Obedience is not about understanding every step before it is taken. It is about trusting that every step is leading somewhere, even when the destination remains unknown. And when the silence finally breaks, when the revelation comes, it will not simply be an answer. It will be the fulfillment of something that could not have been received without first walking through the silence with unwavering faith. There is a moment when striving ceases, when explanations are no longer necessary, when every doubt and every question fades in the presence of undeniable truth. It is the moment when victory speaks for itself. No defense is required, no argument needs to be made, because what once seemed impossible has now come to pass. The struggle, the waiting, the unseen battles fought in silence all culminate in a breakthrough so undeniable that even those who doubted must acknowledge it. Victory, when it comes, carries a weight that cannot be ignored. It does not need validation, nor does it require justification. Those who once questioned your faith, those who doubted the road you walked, those who stood on the sidelines and wondered whether you would ever see the promises fulfilled, they will see it with their own eyes, and when they do, words will be unnecessary, because the evidence will stand before them, unshakable, undeniable, unquestionable. But the journey to such a moment is rarely easy. It is often met with opposition, with seasons of waiting that seem endless, with struggles that test the very core of who you are. There are moments when it feels as if nothing is happening, when prayers seem to disappear into the void, when the silence of God feels heavier than the trials themselves. And yet it is in those very seasons that victory is being forged. Not in loud displays of triumph, but in the quiet endurance of faith. True victory is not about proving yourself to others. It is not about seeking recognition or validation. It is about becoming the kind of person who no longer needs to explain, because the work of God in your life speaks louder than any words ever could. When the breakthrough finally comes, it is not the opinions of others that will confirm it, nor will it be your own efforts that define it. It will be the unmistakable mark of divine orchestration, something so beyond your own ability that it could only have come from the hand of God. Consider those who walked this path before. When Joseph was elevated from a prison cell to the palace of Pharaoh, there was no need for him to explain how his years of suffering had led to that moment. His victory spoke for itself. The very ones who had betrayed him, the very ones who had doubted his dreams, had to stand and witness the fulfillment of what had once seemed impossible, not because Joseph sought to prove anything, but because what had been done in secret had now been made manifest for all to see. Even Christ himself, when he walked this earth, did not argue his identity with those who doubted him. He did not strive to explain what was already evident to those who had eyes to see. His life, his actions, his resurrection, all of it spoke for itself, and those who had questioned, those who had mocked, those who had opposed him, what could they say in the face of undeniable truth? Victory had spoken, and it left no room for doubt. For those who are still in the waiting, for those who have fought battles in silence, for those who have endured seasons of uncertainty, the moment will come when explanations are no longer needed. What is being worked in the unseen will one day be revealed. The very trials that seemed endless, the moments of discouragement, the seasons of struggle, all will make sense when the victory unfolds, and when it does, it will not need to be defended or justified. It will stand on its own, shining with the undeniable proof that God was working all along. So do not be discouraged in the waiting. Do not feel the need to explain yourself to those who do not understand. Do not waste energy proving what time will reveal. Victory, when it comes, will be enough. It will be so clear, so absolute, so evident, that no words will be necessary. And when that moment arrives, you will not need to announce it. The victory itself will do the speaking, and it will declare far louder than any words ever could that God was with you all along.